Many thanks to all of you who are new subscribers to this channel. It is great to see you here, and I'm really grateful for all of your kind support. It has been quite an extraordinary couple of days on many levels. We have seen the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, which was splendid, but was also very moving and emotional. So many of us here in England have never known another monarch on the throne, and it is difficult to imagine the United Kingdom without her at its head. May she rest in peace. I did not expect on such an emotional day that the video on the Royal Burial Vault at Windsor would be quite so popular. I recorded it late at night on a bit of a whim and without a script. I inadvertently referred to Prince Albert as Queen Victoria's wife. Oops, well, it was late and I'm only human. I think at least it made a few of you chuckle on what was a sombre day, and the Queen, who had a fantastic sense of humour, would probably have been very amused indeed. I certainly made myself laugh with such a ridiculous blooper. Now, I'm making this short video today to answer a question that keeps popping up in the comments box of the Royal Vault video, and that is about the Queen's coffin and what form it takes. Now, out of respect for her, I'm not going to say anything directly about her coffin except this. We know that Queen Elizabeth was buried in a coffin that had been prepared about 30 years ago. It was prepared at the same time as a coffin was made for the Duke of Edinburgh. It was made of English oak, and that it contains a lead lining, which is why it weighs about 500 pounds and why it was so very difficult for the soldiers of the bearer party to handle. Instead of speculating further, in this video I'm going to focus on the historic coffins of members of the royal family from before the middle of the 19th century. We know that the late Queen was a stickler for tradition, and I'm sure that her coffin would have been made along very similar lines. Before I get onto that, I want to draw to your attention, just for a few seconds, the Antiquary magazine that I edit. If you like the content you see in this channel and are like me, curious about the obscure aspects of our history, you will love it. With 28 pages of lively text, beautifully illustrated, it comes out every month. There's a link in the bar above to the Antiquary website where you can order it or even subscribe to either a print or a digital copy. As well as getting a lovely magazine, subscribing to the Antiquary helps support my work on this channel. So, to the matter in hand, the coffins of the royal family. And I want to take us back initially to the time of the Tudors, which is when many modern funeral practices begin to emerge in England. And the first image I'm going to show you is this, the railing surrounding the tomb of King Henry VII in Henry VII's chapel, the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey. Now at the bottom, under the tomb, you'll notice that there are steps, and you can see a bit of a glimpse of the interior of a stone-lined burial vault where the king is buried. This second illustration shows the interior of the vault, in which are buried the remains not only of Henry VII, which is to the far right, but his wife Queen Elizabeth of York, who's in the centre, and of their descendant King James I to the left. Now, the vault was opened in the 19th century by Dean Stanley of Westminster, primarily to look for the coffin of James I. Oddly, his remains, and those of many of the other Stuart monarchs buried in the abbey, were not recorded, and the burial places had fallen out of the collective memory. James was eventually found here. Now, you will notice that there are no wooden coffins shown here, but only these three rather sinister looking humanoid lumps. And that's because when Tudor and Stuart monarchs died, they were embalmed. So, a trigger warning, because this is rather grisly. The process of embalming primarily involved the king or queen being eviscerated, having their bowels and the rest of their innards removed. Then they were wrapped up tightly in multiple layers of cere cloth, waxed cloth. They must have resembled Egyptian mummies by the time they got to the end of this process. Then they were placed directly onto a large sheet of lead that was shaped around their form and then soldered at the edges to create an airtight enclosure. And it is those lead enclosures around the two kings and the queen that we see here. Archaeologists refer to this type of lead covering over a corpse as an anthropoidal coffin or an anthropoidal shell. The funeral rites of Tudor and Stuart kings were lengthy, sometimes of many months' duration, and evisceration and embalming, with the use of waxed cloth, beeswax having an antifungal property, and then the clapping of the corpse in sheets of lead, allowed these lengthy rites to take place without the unpleasant aspects of death being obvious. The nobles, whose funerals were arranged by the heralds of the College of Arms, just as the royal family's funerals were, often followed the same practices as the royal family. And for the 15th, 16th and even into the later 17th century, burial in an anthropoidal lead shell was the prevailing fashion for the wealthy. Under the chapel of the castle at Farley, Hungerford and Somerset are a large collection of anthropoidal coffins of the late 17th century containing members of the Hungerford family, including tiny little coffins for infants. Some of this collection are a bit too anatomical for comfort. The anthropoidal lead shell is of course not intended to be seen and wouldn't have been open to view at the funeral nor during the burial rites. The lead covering would have then been placed into a rectangular wooden coffin, perhaps with a gabled roof, which is called a case. So Henry Tudor, James I and Elizabeth of York's eviscerated bodies were wrapped up in 3 layers of waxed cloth, of lead and then of wood. By the 17th century, the outer cases of coffins were becoming very elaborately decorated indeed. Charles II, William III, Mary II, Queen Anne and her husband Prince George of Denmark are all buried in a row in a really tiny burial vault under the side aisle of Henry VII's chapel at Westminster Abbey. And we have this engraving from the early 17th century that shows their coffins tightly packed into the space. We don't see what's inside the coffins, but we can see clearly that the outer case is decorated with what is termed coffin furniture, studs and engraved and repoussé metal plates. The coffins of Mary, William and Anne have repoussé crowns and cross sceptres on them to show that they are sovereigns, and these are made of gilded copper. Note that as well as the coffins themselves, there are also 5 boxes in the vault at the foot of 4 of the coffins and to the side of King Charles's coffin. These are the funerary urns that contain the royal entrails, the bowels, heart, lungs and innards of these respective members of the royal family. Notice that 3 of the urns, those of William, George and Anne, have monograms on them so that you can tell which is which. When Mary II died, she was eviscerated immediately. Her innards were placed in the urn with sawdust and with herbs and was taken immediately to this vault in Westminster Abbey, while the rest of her body in its coffin lay in state. It was a sensible precaution given that her body lay in state from the end of December 1494 to early March of 1695. Now George II and his family were also similarly treated, but then this practice of evisceration just dies out. It dies out as the long lying in state died out too, and none of the royal family have been prepared for burial this way since. With modern embalming techniques, it is of course unnecessary these days. Just as an aside, with respect to George II, he and his wife, Queen Caroline of Ansbach, are buried in a vault in the centre of Henry VII's chapel at Westminster. The royal couple are buried at the east end of this vault in a marble sarcophagus. They were buried in the sarcophagus as George II, who was devoted to his queen, who died 24 years before him, had a particular request in his will, that when he died, the sides of the coffins of himself and Caroline would be removed and the coffins pushed together so that their bones and their dust might mingle. Apparently this did indeed take place, as Dean Stanley found the sides of two coffins leaning up against the vault wall. From the 19th century, there are only a couple of instances when we get the opportunity to look at English royal coffins in some detail. It is perhaps odd to say it, but the two coffins in question are really very beautiful objects indeed. They are works of art in their own right. The first of these is the coffin of Princess Amelia, the daughter of George III and Queen Charlotte. Princess Amelia died in 1810 at the age of 27, and she was the first occupant of the new royal vault at Windsor. She was very well loved by the public, and when she died, it seems bizarre, but engravings were made of her coffin. The coffin was covered with crimson velvet and was adorned with silver studs. A silver coffin plate with her name was on the lid, and bespoke silver handles were decorated with her initials. The second is the coffin of Caroline of Brunswick, the rather derided wife of King George IV. Although she was buried in her native land in the ducal vault at Brunswick Cathedral, she is buried in the coffin provided for her by the King in England. It's probably by the London firm of William Banting, the royal undertakers. It has much in common with the coffin of Princess Amelia. It too is covered in what was the standard striking crimson fabric, though it is evidently less lavish and of lesser quality than Princess Amelia's. Rather than bespoke silver, the coffin is fitted with standard furniture, handles, and a coffin plate made of brass. As was usual, the silk velvet is upholstered and has decoration formed from brass studs. On top is the coffin plate recording Caroline's name and her style. This hadn't been fixed to her coffin prior to it leaving London, and her supporters tried to, rather unsuccessfully, fix their own plates to it while the body was lying in Colchester, one that respected Caroline's request in her will that she be described in death as the injured Queen of England. To see how these royal coffins from the reign of Charles II onwards are constructed, you have to look at other coffins from people lower down the social order. This coffin is from the Nash Mausoleum in Farningham in Kent, and is a fine example of the period. As you can see, it has been covered in a crimson velvet, of which some ragged parts are still adhering to the surface, but most of the wooden case is now down to the bare wood. The giant crack in the end of the timber of the case reveals a lead shell within. This is the second coffin from the same location, and with this coffin the outer wooden case has pretty much disintegrated to reveal the whole of the lead shell. There is a large area of damage to the lead shell at one end, and this has exposed the inner wooden coffin to view, which contains the remains of the deceased. From the late 17th century, this form of coffin was the norm for royalty and for the nobility and for the gentry and for anyone else who could afford it. Now, burial vaults below English churches were often very small, and coffins would be stacked on top of one another in piles to utilise as much space as possible. However, this stacking in piles caused some issues, particularly if the burial vault was damp. Lead is of course heavy, but it's also very soft and malleable, and when the outer wooden case of a coffin decays from the effects of the damp, the weight of upper coffins resting on them can often crush the coffins of those below. Stacks of such coffins can also then fall over and then collapse into the vault, as you can see in this photo, which shows a vault full of tumbling down Archbishops of Canterbury's and their wives from the vault below the chancel at Lambeth Parish Church. This photo shows the interior of the burial vault of John Wilmot, the 2nd Earl of Rochester at Spelsbury in Oxfordshire. He was the famous libertine, a friend of King Charles II. His character was played in the film of that name by Johnny Depp. His coffin has been placed on the vault floor, with his wife's coffin on top of it. His outer wooden case has entirely fallen to dust, and the brass coffin plate from it has fallen off. And as you will see, the lead case around the internal coffin has been crushed and misshapen by the weight of his wife's coffin. Parts of her outer wooden case with brass studs have remained. When we hear the term lead-lined coffin used to describe the burial receptacles of royalty, this is what is being referred to: a casket made of 3 layers of material, a bit like a Russian doll. A timber coffin, which is upholstered within and contains the remains of the deceased, that is then encased entirely on all 4 sides with a shell of lead, which is soldered shut and therefore sealed, and that is in turn enclosed in a timber outer case. This ensures to a large degree that the remains within are protected from putrefaction for a considerable period of time. But in contact with the damp, the outer case will eventually decay, and the lead too might be compromised. In a dry environment, particularly if no excess weight is laid upon a case, the 3 parts may remain reasonably intact for some centuries, protecting the contents within. But eventually they will break down and the contents decompose and decay. Many thanks for watching. I do hope this video doesn't give you too many nightmares. Please do subscribe to the channel and share my videos. You can also help support my channel at PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. Details are below in the description box, and there are links on the homepage.